That the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Labor supports this bill and its progress through its final stages in the House today. And I imagine that every party in the House will be in support of this legislation, which isn't particularly contentious and takes a step that will be very much welcomed by the Red Cross, both in New Zealand and internationally. The bill amends two separate pieces of legislation, the Geneva Conventions Act of 1958 and the Flags, Emblems and Names Protection Act of 1981. It implements New Zealand's obligations under the protocol addition to the Geneva Convention of 1949, and what it relates to is the adoption of an additional distinctive emblem, which is called the Third Protocol. The Third Protocol actually, while it's referred to in the bill as a red crystal, most people would recognise it as a red diamond shape. Most members of the New Zealand community would be familiar with the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. And the Red Cross and the Red Crescent are emblems that are used by nations for their medical workers, including military medical workers and humanitarian workers at times of armed conflict, which gives them protection against attack when they're doing work and retrieving victims from the battlefield and so on. There's actually another emblem that the Minister referred to, the Red Lion and Sun, that had its origins in Iran, but that has largely fallen into disuse. The problem with the Red Crescent and the Red Cross is that they have come to have religious and therefore political connotations. That actually wasn't the intention in the first instance. The Red Cross, which is a red cross on a white flag, is actually the inverse of the flag of Switzerland, which is a white cross on a red flag. And it was chosen because Switzerland perhaps best epitomised the role of neutrality in international affairs. And of course, non-combatants in a battlefield situation that are rescuing injured soldiers or civilians or retrieving the bodies of those who have been killed are in a neutral situation. They are not taking part in the battle that's going on, and it's really important that they have protection in their roles. I guess it's somewhat ironic that we have rules regarding who you can kill and injure and who you can't kill and injure in the course of a battle. It would be much better, if we, it's like standing orders, Mr. Williamson. It'd be much better, of course, if we didn't have wars and nobody was entitled to kill and maim people in the course of fighting. But that's not the reality of the world. And as long as the reality of the world is that there are conflicts, it is better to have rules surrounding that conflict than not to have those particular rules. Mr. Speaker, New Zealand is a party to the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the first and second additional protocols of 1977. These 6 instruments, in fact, represent the core framework of international humanitarian law regulating the conduct of armed conflict, as I've just mentioned. Mr. Speaker, going back to the problem with the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, there were countries in the world that for particular reasons weren't able to adopt either of those emblems, and in particular that applied to Israel and it applied to Eritrea. Both countries expressed the need to have an emblem that would be able to win the respect and the observance of both sides in an armed conflict. And there was a suggestion by Israel that it could be a red Star of David, but that was not deemed to have the same impact on the opposing side on the battlefield, again as Mr. Williamson acknowledges. So a joint working party was set up around about 2000 to propose a third emblem. Now things move reasonably slowly in international fields, and just as slowly in this House, unfortunately, with the passage of this legislation. And in December 2005, the emblem of the red crystal, the red diamond, was finally adopted, and it was adopted by a two-thirds majority. It was seen as a practical solution, and indeed, Mr. Speaker, it has been a practical solution. It's enabled the Israelis and the Palestinians, the Israeli National Society and the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, both to join the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, and to increase cooperation between them. And that, in the highly conflicted situation of the Middle East, is an important factor. The additional protocol did not go through unanimously, however, and a large number of countries that were part of the Arab League and the Organisation for Islamic Conference voted against it. They voted against it not so much because they were opposed to having an additional protocol, an additional emblem, but they did it in protest at Israel's perceived breach of the Geneva Conventions in the occupied Palestinian territories and the Golan Heights. And I'd have to say, Mr. Speaker, that that is a continuing problem. In the last week, to see a decision by the Netanyahu government to illegally settle another 3,000 Israeli citizens on occupied land that they're not entitled to do so is a provocation. And I understand why those countries symbolically opposed the additional protocol on that basis. I feel equally strongly about that. That is a provocation. It is something that stands in the way of the long-awaited peace settlement between the two sides. But I don't believe that we should use that as a reason not to pass this bill today. And in fact, members of the Organisation of Islamic Conference and the Arab League both implicitly acknowledge the importance of having the third emblem and welcoming the cooperation between the Israeli side and the Palestinian side in terms of their particular national societies. So while I understand the protest that has been made by those two groups of countries, I don't believe it is grounds for opposing the adoption of the emblem, and I think that the House should pass this legislation today. The second part of the bill actually extends and strengthens New Zealand's obligation to prohibit the unauthorised use of Geneva Convention emblems. It does that, of course, in the first instance by extending the protection to the red crystal, but it also does it by bringing the penalties into a more realistic framework. The penalties for misuse of the red cross or the red crescent were $1,000. That's been increased tenfold to $10,000, and that probably only brings it in line with inflation. Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee back in 2007 conducted an international treaty examination of the protocol, and they supported ratification. 3 years later, and it was a long time later, a bill came into the House, and another 2 years have passed before we are moving to pass this legislation. Again, I'd ask the National Party to look at how it manages the affairs of this House to hold up non-controversial legislation that all of the parties can support. Mr. Speaker, this should have been moved earlier, but the bill will go through its final stages today. We will then be able to ratify the protocol, and we will be able to implement our obligations under it. 60 countries, as the Minister mentioned, have already ratified. It would be really good to see New Zealand as a country proud of its role in international affairs move more quickly in fields like that, so that we can be at the leading edge of ratifying things that we all agree with, rather than leaving it for the unconscionable length of time that has occurred with those two delays, both in introducing the bill and in getting the bill through the House, when it's just been sitting on the order paper, when every party in the House will probably support it. Mr. Speaker, I support the passage of this bill.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you.